Hello, good afternoon. Welcome to Oxford. Welcome to the latest in our webinar series around impact, social impact, and developmental impact. So this series of webinars is really in support of our executive education programs in the area, but also to share best practice and thought leadership around the community as well. So thank you very much for joining us. We have a very global and international list of participants signing on as we speak. So thank you for that. Today we have Gail Peterson, who is the director of our impact investing and social finance programs, in conversation with two guests, I guess. So one is Professor Alex Nichols, who is the academic director of those two programs and also of our impact measurements program. He's also a professor of social entrepreneurship at the Skoll Centre at the Ivey Business School. And we will also be joined by Bruce Laurie, who is the president and CEO of the Ivey Foundation and has been a regular contributor and guest speaker on our social finance program over the last couple of years. A couple of points. So first of all, we have all the participants are on mute. This is just obviously to kind of keep the airways clear. So we have a couple hundred people signed on. So any comments which you have for us, please enter into the chat box in front of you. Please also enter any questions in there as we go through, which we will address towards the end. We have allocated some time for questions. We have some questions in advance from some registrants, but always happy to hear more. So please type those in there. What else was I going to say? I think that's it. So thank you very much for joining us. Now I will hand you over to Gail. Over to you, Gail.
Yeah, thanks, Steve. Next slide, Bryn. So again, I want to thank you for joining us. We want to bring you to Oxford for a minute to let you see us in action at Saïd Business School. Again, we're focused on really bringing together a world-class community to create change and using capital to do that, and leadership and a variety of other strategies to really look at global impact. We're going to talk about that today. Next slide. Let's look in terms of the impact goals for the portfolio. Again, we have 3 programs, as Steve mentioned, one in social finance, one in impact investing, and one in impact measures. And again, we're really trying to understand through the portfolio how capital impacts the world's complex issues. What are groundbreaking ideas that we can share with the community, and how do we build and strengthen a global community? This webinar really kicks off a series over the summer that leads up to our social finance course in November. In July, we're going to be talking about changing economic models built on sustainability. August is focused on UBS, changing culture and changing commitment within a large conservative bank. And Phyllis Costanza, who's the CEO of Optimus Foundation and Global Philanthropy for UBS, is going to be joining us. In September, we're going to be talking about achieving SDGs through community resilience and community feedback with leaders in the field. So that will give you a sense of how we build and scale the SDGs. Next slide. The agenda for today is to really give you an overview of social finance and ways capital can take the SDGs to scale. We're going to discuss how social finance helps executives put theory to practice and really have a conversation with you and with our panelists to understand what's happening in the field. What are new trends? What are new opportunities? And what are some challenges? This is the connection I just spoke of. Impact investing started, go back to that slide for a second. Impact investing started 8 years ago. Social finance 2 years ago, and impact investing a year ago. And they're complementary programs. Next slide. This shows you our global community. We've reached more than 500 students in 90 countries around the world. These dots represent our cohorts. Next slide. We're going to talk about the Sustainable Development Goals. And Alex is going to go into detail about those, as is Bruce. But again, these are drivers for social change. And when we think about the categories that we're talking about, we're bringing cross-sector, no poverty, zero hunger, good health and well-being, quality education for all, gender equality. Those are big, bold, ambitious goals. And moving them into the private sector, driving change through new resources is really what we're going to be talking about today. Next slide. And that's who we are, Gail Peterson. I'm Gail Peterson, Alex Nichols with his smiling face. Welcome, Alex. And Bruce Laurie, who's been with us since our inauguration at Social Finance in 2017. And Bruce is really here to talk about, we wanted to give you a sense of the guest faculty we bring in, and we use CEOs because we believe they're honest, they can speak very candidly about opportunities and challenges that they're experiencing as they're taking solutions to scale. And Bruce has been with us, as again, for 2 years. And our goal is to, in the candidate experience, is to really understand how and give students a flavor for how things evolve within systemic change when you're dealing with government buy-in, corporate buy-in, civil society buy-in, and how philanthropy can actually be a catalyst to unite those sectors to actually achieve ambitious goals in climate change. So Alex, next slide. It's over to you.
Hi, it's nice to speak with you all. Alex here. So I just want to give you a couple of sets of slides, looking at firstly the social finance universe in a bigger context, and then just some slides about practice, by which I mean a bit of a sense of what the market looks like and some data we have on returns and segments of activity and so on, and that will relate partly to the SDGs that Gail was talking about. I mean, I should say that we've been working on this stuff for more than a decade, and it continues to be a really exciting field, and one where we're seeing incredible innovation. Of course, the significance of this is that it's one of the key levers to help us address the big problems we have in the world. So in some ways it's still a small market, but its potential and its impact could be enormous. So it's been very exciting to work on it, and we always enjoy working on it with our students when they come to Oxford. Next slide, please. So in the spirit of thinking about context, the first interesting thing to remember is that this idea of allocating capital or finance for some sort of social impact is not new, but we sometimes forget our histories. But it's useful to, I think, always to take a historical perspective just for a moment. So if we look at some of the things you'll see on the slides, there's been a history of mechanisms by which private capital is allocated for impact, whether that's through a religious framework like Islamic finance or tithing, or whether it's through the emergence of public taxation, whereby the state effectively takes a proportion of private capital and uses it for common welfare, or more recently, from the Victorian period onwards, thinking about different kinds of structures to recognise the use of money or capital for social impact, such as charities that become a legal form in Britain in the 19th century, the rise of cooperative and mutual structures, which also emerge in the UK in the early 19th century, and now actually one of the most widely used forms of incorporation in the world, although they're not often recognised as such. CDFIs more recently, and so on. So we've had a history that's worth reflecting on in this space. Sometimes when we think about this as being all about innovation and novelty and newness, sometimes we can learn a lot from the past. So the key point, I think, for us is that although this isn't a new idea, there is a clear new wave of innovation, institutions, instruments since 2000, or perhaps a little bit earlier, whereby people are largely recognizing that market capital has a role to play and impact if it's properly organized, and this is a big opportunity. Next slide. So here's the kind of bigger picture of some of the trends. This is sort of very sketchy kind of outline here. There's a lot of detail behind all of these that we could discuss in class. But essentially what I think we can see, certainly in most developed democracies and market-driven democracies, changes in the three big sectors: the private sector, the public sector, and the third or charitable sector. And all these different changes over, let's say the last 30 years or so, have helped create spaces for the rise of social finance and impact investing. So just briefly to go through them in terms of private markets, the growth of socially responsible investing, or SRI. We'll look at a little bit of information about that in a minute, and then within that, more focused ESG, or environmental and social governance finance. This is now a big market, and we'll look at that in a moment. And it's kind of reflecting investor pressure, as well as, I think, the opportunity for new markets, and I'll say something a little bit more about that in a minute. And also, perhaps most interestingly, risk adjustment, and some evidence that investments in these types of instruments certainly doesn't underperform the market, but may even outperform it, and either way may offer a risk adjustment factor in a bigger portfolio. So there's been increasing interest from the mainstream markets to come into this space for various reasons. When we think of the public sector or the government, there's been a big drive initially towards more effectiveness, which in the 80s and 90s was bringing sort of private market thinking into the public sector. So-called new public management was focused on effectiveness. More recently, we've seen a shift towards not just effectiveness, but efficiency. So using government resources to create better outcomes per dollar or yen or pound or euro. And in fact, in both spaces, there's been opportunities for social investment and social finance to come in, whether it's supporting social enterprises that deliver public services, or helping capitalize social impact bonds or outcomes-based contracts to create greater efficiency. At the same time, in the third sector, there's been a realization that as the world's problems have grown and we've become more aware of them, there's simply not enough grants and donations to support the organizations at the front line that want to address the big issues of the world. And this has partly driven the rise of social enterprise, which are social purpose, market, profit-making organizations, but has also redefined, I think, the way foundations and development finance institutions think about capital and how they can address big problems. So we've seen all these kind of trends coming together, and I think they've been part of the reason we've seen the rise of this second wave of social finance that I mentioned earlier. Next slide. Oh yes, so this is just more mood music. So for example, the Economist had a big piece of work a couple of years ago looking at how millennials are really motivated towards using their capital for impact. So that's one set of issues I'll come back to in a moment. But also the dramatic and most shocking piece of mood music here is the annual finance gap to achieve the SDGs between now and 2030. And this is probably a lower end of the estimates, say 2.5 trillion per year. And that just gives us some sense of the requirement to bring in other capital than purely public money or development finance money if we want to get to these SDGs over time. So there's this big gap. That's another driver for trying to bring in this other sort of capital in. So next slide, sorry. Yeah, so this is that sort of to emphasize that report from the Economist. This is JP Morgan report in 2017, which is worth just reflecting on for a moment. So the key point here is about the transfer of wealth intergenerationally, and it's likely that transfer of wealth between generations will be the largest transfer of wealth in human history. Somewhere around 58–60 trillion dollars of wealth will be passed from parents to children over the next 35 years. So an enormous amount of money. And what's interesting is, those people who might receive that money over time, 90% of the women involved have a clear interest in using capital for impact, and 45% of millennials also have an interest. That goes back to that Economist report we've just seen. So even if these figures are overstated, which they might be, there's clearly a demographic trend here. As women investors become more important, and as millennials get hold of the money from their parents, this is going to drive a big opportunity for fund managers and for investment funds and banks and others to find a big new source of capital for impact and for social environmental projects. Next slide. And here are some of the new trends in the market. So on the one hand, we have that supply side set of demographics. The likelihood there's more money coming into impact from the owners of capital. On the other hand, there's a lot of innovation in sectors that can take that kind of investment, and which many times align with some of those SDGs that we've just seen earlier. So whether it's housing, community development, or small business finance, microfinance, of course, a big sector now in green and climate finance, education also, enormously huge opportunities for education investment, particularly in developing countries, and so on. You can see the examples. So, I mean, there are many other sectors. These are just some of the trends where I think there are real new market opportunities, but also with tied closely to potential impact. So this is the kind of demand side that's growing, and much of this is framed and aligned to the SDGs as a kind of heuristic for understanding how the capital can be allocated for impact. Now, of course, in all of this, there's many questions about what does impact really mean, and how do we categorize that and measure it and report it. But if you want to know more about that, you have to come to our impact measurement class, which will be in July and then next year. Next slide. So this is just back to ESG. This is all, again, mood music, kind of background noise to the growth of this market. And the ESG market, you can see here, has grown very substantially over the last 15 years. And I think this, this demonstrates that there's a significant amount of money now that goes at least into some kind of screened investing. This indicates a concern with social and environmental factors. Now, I wouldn't necessarily class this as all impact or social investing per se, but it's definitely a sign of this interest in capital that has a social purpose, and that's a non-trivial set of data. Next slide. And this is just one snapshot, and there are many snapshots of this kind of information that just suggests the assumption that if you wish to focus capital on environmental or social goals, or at the very least screen out the worst examples of being pernicious in terms of their effects in those areas, the notion you have to somehow lose money is not clearly the case. And this graph simply shows the performance of an index of ESG rated stocks against the market, against the S&P 500. And what you can see over time is it's pretty much tracked it, slightly outperforming it most of the time in this big time sequence now from 1990 through to 2015. So it is only one snapshot, and of course it's not the case that every social investment or ESG investment outperforms the market, but certainly there's decent evidence you don't necessarily have to take a haircut on performance to focus on social environmental investing. Next slide. So that's a bit of mood music, and just to summarize, what I'm saying is that there are a set of drivers for why social finance is important at the moment in the public sector, the private sector, and the third sector. There are clear opportunities on the supply of capital side with transfer of wealth to millennials and women investing, and there's an increasingly structured demand side of new markets based around SDGs. And the mood music is this market is growing, and ESG is one example of a part of that. So let's think more in detail now, just the second part of my comments on social finance in practice. So next slide, please. So the real point here is that, why do we need this? Well, because of the market failure in funding social impact. That's the basic point here, that the markets are not recognizing the value of impact in their valuations, or indeed perceiving this market opportunity as being risky simply because it's new, or because it has, at the moment, a lack of fully formed accounting standards. It's hard to get out because there's a lack of market platforms to exit from social investments, and so on. So it's basically a classic, early market. And we've seen these before in venture capital and elsewhere. It's nothing new. But because of that, people perceive it as risky, and they want a kind of return which is commensurate with that risk. But actually, this is just a market failure. And I think as we establish the opportunities for returns as well as risk mitigation in social and environmental investing, some of this will disappear. But it does look as if social impact risk is overestimated. In other words, the market's saying we can't get sufficient returns on these kind of investments to make them worth doing at the moment. But as we saw, the ESG graph we just saw suggests this may well not be the case. But so we need social finance because there's a market failure in the mainstream markets funding this space. Next slide. So how might we define the distinctive features of social finance? Well, the first and most important thing is that impact is intentional. So the baked into the model of the social investment fund structure or deal will be intentionality of impact. So it'll be focused primarily on an impact outcome, whether that's social or financial, and that will be hard baked into the the deal structure, the contract structure, the fund structure, and will be measured and managed as the investment goes forward, and will be reported clearly. So because of that, these emerging models have distinctive data, instruments, markets, and exits, and they have distinctive risk and return dynamics, and they have their own policy agendas that have emerged around the world just for this market. And most interestingly, perhaps, they allow the opportunity to blend capital in different ways, so-called commingling. So I think there are distinctive features, and one of the key points is about that first bullet point. In other words, if somebody is claiming this is an impact or social investment, then you simply ask them to show you not the money, but show you the impact. If they are not managing and measuring and reporting the impact of their investment, then it's not an impact investment. It's some other kind of investment that may have benefit, but it's not in this space. Next slide. So this is just that blended finance idea. I won't go through all of this in detail now. We can take questions on it, but essentially what it says is that social finance is extraordinary in terms of markets because it goes right from 100% loss capital, which of course are grants, you give them away, you don't expect any financial return, right up to kind of market rate or just around market rate, social value, what we call finance first investments. And then in the middle, you've got some blend. You've got some returns, sometimes sub-market, sometimes around market, sometimes not risk adjusted to the market, but some level of return with a clear impact mandate. And so because you've got this whole space, you can blend different types of capital. So you could take some grants, for example, put them in a deal or fund structure with some impact first capital to bring in some finance first capital in order to allow the overall return to be attractive to this other sorts of capital. So because you have this palette, if you like, of types of capital to paint your picture with, you can really create interesting new deals and leverage the market capital in that will be at the right, which wouldn't otherwise come into social investment. It's by allowing us to blend that we do that. And so at the top, you've just got these potential return rates from minus 100% grants up to market rate, and then you've got these blended models that tend to be like 0 to 5% or 3 to 9%, so under 10%, under double-digit returns. Then you've got estimates of the amount of either available capital or invested capital in these spaces running on the top, and then you've got some instruments and then some definitions below at the bottom of venture philanthropy, impact investing, and social finance categories. So it's quite a complicated slide, but the point to take away is simply that this is a space that has many more types of capital than the conventional risk-adjusted market model that we think of in the mainstream. And that's a really exciting opportunity to bring in different types of money to impact. Next slide, please. Okay, so it's global. This is a slightly out-of-date slide, so I apologize if your country is on here but doesn't have any examples. One or two of these don't exist anymore, but it's just generally to show you that that even, this is probably 5 or 6 years old, this slide, that this is a global phenomenon, and we now have 20 odd countries that have global steering groups or national advisory boards for their impact finance market, and so there's a global network emerging around this space, but lots of activity going on around the world in the south and the north. Next slide. So then just to finish up with just some data snapshots. Now I have to say data in this space is very difficult. We don't have any consolidated data sets. We don't have a Bloomberg or a central repository of performance. We have snapshots. And one of the better snapshots is produced by the Global Impact Investing Network, or GIN as they're called. They do an annual survey of a group of social investors and impact investors. Now it's not by any means the whole universe. So you should assume these numbers are too low. In the most recent report, they said that they thought the market was about $500 billion, $502 billion US in impact investing around the world. I think that's significantly too low, but it gives you a kind of bottom line number. And of course, if you put that in context, that's tiny compared with the global markets at the moment. So we have to be honest about that, but growing. Next slide. So here's from the previous year's GIN report, some idea of where these investments are going. So you can see the strong interest in energy and microfinance, financial services excluding microfinance, but then 9% in microfinance. So basically, different sorts of finance and energy are the bigger chunk of all this kind of investing at the moment, then housing, agriculture, and so on. You can see the other slices. So it gives you a flavour of where where the money's going. Next slide. These from the same report are the instruments being used. It's not a terribly clear slide, I apologise, but you can see that essentially this is primarily a private debt and private equity play. So the majority of the instruments used here are in the private markets. There is some public equity and public debt. It's a much smaller part of this, and that's largely because liquidity is difficult in the space. We don't have a social stock market as such or any other way of easily getting out. So most of these are private deals at the moment. The two coloured bars here are simply in their survey they had one or two outliers that were much bigger than everybody else. So you can see the numbers are kind of excluding outliers and then with them all included. That's the difference in the two colours. Next slide. So here's about the stage of business. This is where the money's going. And again, it's interesting that it suggests it's not particularly risky capital from their survey, which is only, as I say, a subset of all the people working in this space. It's those who reply to the GIN survey. As you can see, most of it's going into mature trading companies or private companies or growth stage companies with very little at seed and startup and venture stage. Now, partly this is because those types of ventures can often access grant capital because they're social or environmental. So I think that's a distortion in these numbers. You shouldn't assume that social investors never take risks with early stage ventures, but actually it's partly because they can often access free money, and therefore why would they not do that? Okay, next slide. Bit about deal size. So the overall thing to take away from this is that deals are on average small, kind of roughly $3 million in this sample. Again, there'll be many other examples in the market that aren't in the GIN survey that might be larger than this, but this is the kind of average, and this is broken down in these slides between developed market and emerging market. That's DM and EM types of investors, and then down by the instruments, private equity, private debt, and then something about expectations of the market rate or below market. But overall sample is about 2.8 million average size, so quite small. Next slide. A very, very rare example of an attempt to actually talk about returns. I don't really know of any other attempt to do this in quite this way. So this again is just from the GIN survey, so it's limited by the number of respondents they have, but nevertheless it gives us some information. So here you've got debt and equity on the left and the right, and within that you've got either an expectation of market rate or below market rate returns. This would be those blended finance examples in the middle of our spectrum picture we looked at earlier, those who don't expect a market return necessarily. And then you've got the range and the average. So I think a couple of things to see. One is that most of these are not losing money. There's only really developed market and market rate debt that's going to look, that has lost money. And equally, that if you look at the equity returns or market rate developed market investments, they can be very attractive. In some cases at the extreme end, giving more than 30% IRR. So this underlines the point that generally you can make money, at least in their survey, not that many losses, and overall there's a decent level of return, if not a fully risk-adjusted market return. Next slide. And the final slide I'll look at just is a FT survey looking at impact investors and asking them about their returns in terms of a spectrum of gain to loss and the percentages. And then on the left-hand side of the graph, you have actual past 3 years returns, and on the right-hand side, you have predicted returns. And again, if you work through this starting at the bottom where people are losing money and then getting very small returns, you can see from this survey at least, most people are making at least a decent return. Some of them a very attractive return. So again, we have to be careful about this being a potentially biased sample, but it does show once again you can at least, in some circumstances, get decent returns on these investments. So it allows us to take away that assumption that you can't make money in this sector. Okay, so let's hand over to Gail now.
Thanks, Alex. Again, I think we're going to go from macro level trends down to very specific, let's get our hands dirty in deals. And one of the things we do is in social finance is every afternoon students work together. Again, our students represent across sectors to really understand what it takes to actually do deals in the context of social finance. So for example, with UBS Optimus Foundation, we have a case from giving to investing. We look at 3 development impact bonds, 2 of the first in the world, one in health and education in Rajasthan, India, how to structure the deal, how to negotiate partnerships, how to measure impact, and how to exit. Similarly, Humanity United has created a working capital fund to understand how to track, use technology to track slavery in the supply chain. Bringing together as investors, private sector investors for whom slavery exists in the supply chain and how do they avoid the problems associated with that, removing it, how to use capital to spur new innovation to allow private sector and government to better understand where slavery exists and how to eliminate it. We focus on climate change in the context of divest invest and ways you can invest in new programs with a gender lens investment. We look at sustainable cities in the context of how do you promote multi-sector blended capital deals that will enhance the viability of urban cities around the world to maintain a community that's vibrant in the center city, and how do you relate to those communities, neighborhoods within the cities. Regarding our work with Bruce Laurie at Ivey Foundation, we look again at, we have a case study specifically of how we use deliberate leadership as a tool for pulling together collaborative solutions to scale climate mitigation and low carbon efficiency strategies countrywide. Another illustration is how do we include community feedback measures, the people whose lives we're trying to improve through new capital investment, that they actually have a voice, that power dynamics are changed, and their feedback is important to measure and include in the success of any kind of investment. So we look holistically from what it takes to create a partnership, to structure blended capital deals, how to mobilize those money, how to understand impact, and then how to create cultural buy-in within your own organization. Often what we're talking about are new ways of thinking, certainly in the area of finance. Social change is not the norm. So how do we get an organization like a UBS or conservative banks to actually adopt new sustainability practices? So we talk about those strategies and what happens when you hit a brick wall within your own organization, and how do you address those issues? So leadership, systems change, impact measures, deployment of capital, and exit. They're programs of study, and we address those every afternoon to allow students to go deep into the experience. Next slide. Next slide, and I'm going to turn it over to Bruce, and he's going to give you, again, an illustration of the kind of depth and experience that students get in the context of Canada's clean energy transition. Over to you, Bruce.
Great, thanks very much, Gail. As you've just said, Gail, I think what our goal is in our work, and I'm trying to get across, is how do you, when you work in, say, the world of philanthropy, or you run a large NGO, or maybe you're responding to this through some corporate relationship, how do you really look at how this lands on the ground? What are the practical things that you can do, lessons that you can learn? And for us, we define it in this deliberate leadership model, which is really deciding that you want to achieve some very big concrete outcomes. For us, it's helping Canada transition to a clean economy, and then putting together the pieces that include, in large measure, the social and sustainable finance piece, and then figuring out your partners, et cetera. So next slide, please. So, part of what we've done coming at it from a systems change perspective is really recognizing that to be successful, we need to analyze the problem. And, one thing that I think is interesting with this program and what I've found being there the last couple of years is, we often, when we hear from philanthropy, we get a very particular perspective, often there's so much, such a large philanthropic community in the U.S. We get kind of a U.S.-centric philanthropic view. Often on the SDG climate policy, we get a Eurocentric view. But what we really realize is that, when we have students from all over the world, whether you're in Brazil or Australia or Japan or Indonesia or India, all of these countries are dealing with these issues in very different ways. They have different circumstances, different political cultures, different structures of NGOs, finance, philanthropy. So for us, it's really looking at, the problem analysis from your own particular context. How do you really understand where it is that you are working and what's relevant in your particular? So for us, it's really looking at these new ideas, reframing the problem in Canada, new organizational arrangements. As Gail noted, a big part of this is the challenge in all of these is how do we rethink the way we communicate and engage with people. It's critical ultimately for us to work with government. Some countries, less so. Many countries, governments still are the relevant players. And then ultimately, this is all about, leveraging more capital to be supporting the resolution of these challenges that we're facing. And our strategy is really this idea of, leading change from within. So how do we become the focal point? Next slide, please. When we look at the issues, one of the things we discovered, and I guess just to step back for a moment, there are many different ways of framing these issues, and people are coming at it from different perspectives, whether it's an international development kind of SDG frame, a social finance frame. For some, it's a climate risk frame, a climate finance, a sustainability finance, and these are all different words that mean similar things, but very often not the same thing. So, how you frame a problem is really important. And for us, we really tried to frame climate change as a very different kind of problem. It's not just an environmental issue, it's a social issue, it's an economic issue, technology and innovation issue. So that's a critical piece of the work that we've done. How do you motivate people to change? I mentioned this idea of sort of finding the center. That's the approach that we take. Ultimately, for all of this, it's creating shared vision, and then really, having I think a sharp sense of what is the impact that you're trying to deliver. And for us, it's really this notion of accelerating the transition to a diverse, efficient economy. And I'll just, if you can just zip through these fairly quickly, I just wanted to provide a sense of the theory of change. So the idea is, if the benefits of a low carbon sustainable economy are communicated, if public agencies have capacity to implement, Alex spoke a fair bit about the, metrics and measurement and monitoring. If we have those in place, we can measure where we're at. If policies shift to be supportive and are adopted, the big piece that we'll be talking about, public-private investors, receive positive market signals, and this means creating the policy environment. It means creating the incentives. It means really defining what that space is. Then for us, those will be the conditions that are in place to move us to a low-carbon economy. Next, please. One of the challenges that we've faced here is this idea of the environmental issues have become kind of icons that are used by the left and right in different ways. And so rather than having an intelligent debate about how do we address these fundamental social and economic challenges that we're facing around climate, it's become this, very polarized, simplistic, stop pipelines because they're the problem, or put a price on carbon, that's the solution. And so for us, we're always working in this, trying to break out of this polarized, divisive, and unhelpful conversation. And I would argue that it's, frankly, that the, which is always a fun debate to have in these programs, is, to what extent are environmental activists contributing to polarization as opposed to helping us break through polarization. Next, thank you. So just to summarize those points for a moment. So if we have poorly defined problems, will lead to, the wrong kinds of solutions. What I, share with people in the, environmental activist community where I was just speaking last week, if only a small number of people share your outrage, it's not likely going to be an easily solved problem. And for us, we're sort of looking at this notion of, perhaps we need to make these problems bigger. We think they're big problems, but what we mean by making them bigger is that, fundamentally, we don't solve or invest in transit solutions to solve climate change. We primarily invest in transit solutions to, advance personal mobility. There are issues of, kind of in public transit. For large cities like Toronto, we're facing, congestion problems. So really, you need to figure out, like, what are the bigger social and economic problems that you're trying to solve. And I think this applies across the board for a lot of the SDGs. If you look at things like toxic chemicals, really have to get into health, or I'll be talking more in the program about the Canada. We were the first jurisdiction here in Ontario to phase out entirely all coal-fired power plants, and that was done looking through a framework of public health. So we'll talk a little bit more about that, and these are some of the things that will come up in the working sessions that Gail described. Next, please. I'm actually not really going to spend time going through all of this, but really it's just a little bit of detail on the challenge that I see us facing globally right now, which is this highly polarized environment. And I'll happily be talking about some of the things that we can do to try to break through polarization. A tough issue, but critical for everyone working on these things. Next, please. And I guess one of the most fundamental things that we decided to do as a foundation and working with philanthropic partners in Canada is this idea that we actually didn't have adequate institutional capacity to address this clean economy transition problem. And so these are different pieces of capacity. And again, I won't go through all of this right now, but this idea of actually trying to create new institutional arrangements, new collaboratives. Some of these are government organizations that we've helped create. Some of them are independent organizations. Some of them are foundation collaboratives. Some of them are data agencies. But it's but essentially the idea is, if we're going to rethink how to solve these problems, then the fundamental notion is that many of the organizations that we've had in the past just simply aren't, our view, at least in the Canadian context, we just haven't had the capacity to think about these challenges in different ways. And next, please. And again, I won't run through all the details, but one thing that's been kind of fun for us, and it was the idea that we had at the very outset when Gail approached me about the social finance program, was to really look at the work of the Ivey Foundation and its partners in this idea of kind of an ongoing learning cycle. So some of the things that we were discussing 2 years ago, we had no idea if they would fail or succeed. And so we now have a little bit of a trajectory of, trying different ideas, discussing them with students, testing them out with different people we work with, and and then coming back, now for the third year and really looking at, of the things we talked about, what has actually been succeeding and what hasn't been succeeding, and quite happily, we're very happy with the progress that's been made. Who knows where we will be a year from now. Next, please. So just to summarize, the way we think about this issue. So we talk about solving climate change, but really we're talking about this great global economic and social transition. Next, please. We often, and Alex was looking at the particular numbers around, how much, what are the financial implications of this? So on the one hand, we see tremendous potential financial losses due to climate change. Next, please. But at the same time, we recognize that there are unprecedented economic opportunities associated with the massive investments that will be required. And I think another thing that we'll touch on in the course is this idea of social finance, sustainable finance, climate finance. What do they all mean? How do they fit together? And my conclusion through my participation in the social finance program is that it isn't one or another. It's all of these things and understanding how they connect together. Slide, please. The new climate economy report came up with this number of a $26 trillion economic benefit to the global economy if we invest wisely in the low carbon transition. Next, please. And we'll get into some of the details of the very significant insurance losses that we're seeing globally. I think this idea of the many of the scenarios that we're on right now in terms of where we're going with climate change suggest that large parts of the world simply will not be insurable. So, this is one of the driving factors behind finance sector participation in the climate and low carbon economy conversation. Next, please. And next, please. Next, please. So for us, it's really a question of looking at social finance as a way to test some of the creative finance tools that we need to solve these problems. But the end game is working with mainstream finance and shifting mainstream capital to align with this transition broadly around sustainability. So it's a transition for how we build things, how we move goods and people, how we grow and distribute food, and how we generate and use energy. Next, please. And I think just given the time we have, I'm going to skip over this as well. Next, please. I think, Gail, I'm just going to, these are some of the elements that we've come up with, but I think I'm just going to turn it back over to you.
No, that sounds great. I mean, again, we're doing speed dating today, Bruce. Your work has been phenomenal, but again, it gives our audience a sense of the detail and the level of commitment we're making to understanding what scale and SDGs mean. Steve, you've got lots of questions. We've been getting emails saying lots of questions coming in. So let's turn it over to you so that we can answer some of those questions for our audience.
Okay, so thank you, Gail, Bruce, Alex, for those comments. We have had, I would say, lots of questions that have come through over the last 45 minutes or so. So thank you very much for those. Thank you also for some of the supportive comments we've had from some of the alumni. So thank you for those. Maybe we'll start with this first question, which was sent in advance, and then I'll pick 2 or 3 out of the ones which have come in online. So this first one, Gail and Alex, we saw in finance. Have you experienced, or what resistance or opposition have you experienced around the topic of sustainable development? Do you have any quick advice around that?
Well, I actually think that this is an issue that Phyllis Costanza and all of our faculty will address, is how do you bring into organizations that have something new and different? And so I'm going to say, come to class to join us. It requires political savvy, it requires a commitment of leadership, and it requires a leadership at the top, working all the way down through the supply chain. So we're going to actually spend a considerable amount of time on this, getting the idea of sustainable development to stick within an organization. But yeah, there is resistance and opposition to it. Anytime there's something new and different that's introduced into a culture, there's reluctance to change. Alex, I don't know if you've got any other ideas. If not, we can move on to questions.
Just very quickly, I mean, I would refer you back to some of the slides I put up there. I think the argument here is that there is a latent demand for this kind of stuff that's going to hit us like a positive tidal wave, and if you're not prepared for that as a financial institution, you're going to be in trouble. On the other side, Bruce has said, if you don't prepare yourself for the change in valuation of stocks and other investments, which is going to be the consequence of climate and other things, you're also in a very stupid position. So the key here is education, and that's part of what we do and others do, is to try to make sure people in the market understand this space better, because the biggest reason people can't move this forward is ignorance. People don't understand it, or they're worried about it. So education is key here.
Well, and I add one more point, which is the consumers, the clients, are demanding a new way of thinking and a new way of acting. And if in fact institutions don't respond positively, then you're right, they'll be left behind. And I think how we can help organizations make that transition is what social finance is all about. So Steve, next question.
Yeah, this one's particularly for you, Bruce, if we can. So a question has come through for you on your case studies. Which has been the most difficult problem to define and why?
The most difficult problem to define?
Yeah.
I think really it's I guess it's the challenge of what does the future look like if we don't have a large fossil fuel economy. So I think where people are struggling is everybody understands the world that they're in today, but it's very hard, for good reason, to understand an unknown world that we're trying to get to. And so painting a picture of an alternative for people, or giving people comfort that, if they work in the oil industry, that they will have a future, even if the oil industry declines or disappears. I would say that's the single hardest problem to go on. Okay,
thank you. This is a question which may be addressed by you, Bruce, but let's call it an open question. Going back to the issue of blended finance, in blended finance, how do donors feel about facilitating increased return for those investors who are seeking market rate?
Michael, shall I say something?
Well, I actually, yeah, go ahead, Alex.
Just briefly, I mean, so yes, I think that's going to be handled very carefully. So it's not an easy conversation, but the argument is a simple one. That's that you could give away $1 million and have $1 million of impact, or you could use it in a blended deal that would have 10, 50, $100 million of potential impact. So yes, the return question has to be carefully handled, but why, at least in principle, would you not want to use your $1 million to have 10, 15 times more impact?
Well, and I think we're watching many foundations, especially those that work at a global level, actually doing that and really setting aside funds that can be used as catalytic and get a market rate return. So we'll be exploring specific illustrations where that catalytic fund, those funds can actually be multipliers for resources. So the good news is there's a wave of philanthropists, particularly globally, that are looking at serving that role as catalyst.
Okay, next question. So broad question around the general theme of measurement. But are there any social impact metrics applicable to any social impact investment? For example, living wage, carbon footprint, etc. Or does every specific investment have its own specific specialized impact measure? What's your experience on that, please?
Alex, I mean, I'm happy to talk about it too.
Well, just briefly, so it's a mix of the two. So, I mean, there are well-established measurements for interventions and for activities in all kinds of sectors that you could just take off the shelf. And then there will be more complicated measures you need to define deal by deal, project by project. So there is an awful lot you can take straight off the shelf that's in terms of methods and metrics. People shouldn't think that's a problem. It isn't. But, you know, it depends on the project, depends on the fund, depends on the objective. Sometimes if it's a complex intervention, you need to think about a specific set of measures. Often you don't. But one of the big misnomers about impact measurement is that it's hard. It's not hard. It's actually just complicated. It's just slightly different.
Yeah, and I agree. I think it's important to understand that measurement has been around for decades. And so finding right partners that can help shape and inform decisions around impact measures is going to be important. So there isn't a canned solution, but because context is important, but it's not a black hole.
Okay, thank you. Next question. So the question is, how can social finance overcome risks, for example, cultural, social, etc., when trying to reach its intended impact area?
I can say, I mean, one quick point is it's about careful design of the program and the measurement systems that are taking the investment. And the key point there, in my view, is that very careful consultation embedding in that process target populations with whom you work. So if you want to, be sure, or as sure as you can, that you're having a good effect and good impact, you need to build in a way of communicating with the populations you're working with. Now, it's different, of course, if it's the environment. That's a different set of issues. But where there's social welfare programs, that participatory discussion about designing programs and then measuring their success will allow the risk of your money being wasted to be diminished. Now, if the question here was more about financial risk, that's a different set of issues. And one way around that is, of course, the blended models we've been describing. It's a way of de-risking some deals by bringing in other types of capital. But those are the two broad things I'd say. Gail?
Yeah, and again, I think if we think about where we center our capital and the structures that we create, we always put the communities at the center. So the reason we have sessions on community resilience, community feedback, is because at the end of the day, that's what impact is, right? Whose lives are you changing? Are they being improved? Are you doing no harm? So that's what we structure these social finance deals. And we have a very candid conversation about how do you get community feedback? How do you build relationships and partnerships at a local level? And how do you do no harm? And that's the risk side, both financially and socially. So we are very intentional about that aspect of the course. So come join us and you'll learn more.
Thank you very much. We do have more questions. We'll probably struggle to answer any of them in a minute or so, which we have left. These are a couple more questions on the screen now, which came in advance. I guess if we can address the top question on here, please, maybe as a final question. So what is your take on the role of social bonds in mobilizing capital for SDGs?
We just need to be very briefly clear here between what's described as the social use of proceed bonds, which are essentially just debt products that are focused clearly on a social outcome, and social impact bonds, which are a very different kind of model. In terms of developing debt products that can address specifically welfare or social care issues, that's great. There's already a big green bond market doing that in the environment, so that's good too. This seems to me an emergent area that, from what I understand, they are beginning to establish some protocols and some measures. That's always the key. You can call anything you like social, but you need some measures to prove that's actually happening. But broadly speaking, good idea.
Well, and I also think that Bruce, your transition bonds are another illustration of how the use of proceed bonds are being morphed and modified. So we can go deep into that at the social finance course. But these are terms of what we call lost in translation. How we define what's evolving, what's emerging is, I think, what's exciting about the social finance course. Steve, anything else? Do you want to close this down for us?
Yeah, I think so. So just to say thank you again for those people who have submitted questions which we haven't had a chance to answer in a minute or two, which we have. They're probably questions which we could and should spend a significant amount of time going over and through those. For example, how do we get more money into the market? How do we make sure that donations aren't subsidizing or taking away private investment and so on? So thank you very much for all those questions. I hope that we can follow on with those with you afterwards. An ideal way of doing that obviously would be to join us for a week in Oxford in one of our programs where we take a deep dive into all of these issues. As you can see on the screen, and you may be aware, we have 3 programs in this area, each running once a year. The impact investing program we've run for this year, and it's coming up in March. So we had pretty much filled that course by the end of the calendar year last year. So if you are interested in joining us in March 2020, then please do consider applying now, or certainly over the summer. The impact measurement program, which obviously goes into much more detail on measurement, we touched on that quickly just now, is coming up in a week or two's time. That program has also been fully subscribed for the last month or so. So that one is full now. Social finance really looks at the blended capital idea and how to allocate capital from across the range to big problems, including climate change, but across the SDG spectrum. That one is in November. We have a good group for that already, but there are still a few places available. If you would like to join us in November, then we recommend that you apply over the next 3 weeks by the end of July, because we may well be into a waiting list area from then. Finally, just really want to say thank you to everybody involved today. Thank you to the participants who have been online and have been sending questions in. Thank you very much to our guest speakers, so to Bruce Lowry from the Ivey Foundation, Alex Nichols, Professor of Social Entrepreneurship at Science Business School, and to Gail Peterson, our Programme Director. Thank you very much, and we hope you can join us again on one of these webinars in the not too distant future. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Yeah, thank you. Bye.
Thanks.
Bye.